We all love throwing a frog. Oh my God. But frog fishing also has a lot of frustration.
Oh gosh. Oh gosh. Yeah. Oh, are you kidding me?
Today I want to talk about 5 tips that will help you catch more and bigger fish on a frog, so stay tuned, it's going to be a good one. This video is brought to you by Sportsman'sOutfitters.com. At Sportsman's Outfitters, they have all my favorite frogs like the Spro Poppin frog, the Bronzeye 65, the Strike King Poppin Perch, the KVD Sexy Frog, and much, much more. If you guys are on the market for some frogs, some frog rods, reels, lines, whatever it may be, click those links down below in the description. No matter if you have been fishing your entire life or you're just getting started in bass fishing, fishing a frog is just one of those lures that is very addictive. Seeing that bass come up and hit that bait, setting the hook with braided line and getting that fish in the boat or on the shore, there's just nothing like it. And one of the best things about a frog is that it works in a lot of different situations, from ponds to big lakes and everything in between. Now, when I'm speaking about fishing a frog today, I am speaking about fishing a hollow body frog like the one that I have here. This is a Strike King Poppin Perch. I'm not referring to the plastic toad style baits that you simply kind of crank in across the top. Now, there are 5 things that I think will help you to catch a lot more fish on a frog. And the first one is actually the speed at which you fish a frog. This is something that I feel like a lot of guys don't talk about, they don't happen to mention, but it's something in my mind that I've seen be the biggest difference in getting bit on a frog and not. Several years ago, I was preparing for a little local tournament on Indian Lake here in Ohio, and during the day that I practiced, I was catching fish on a frog. But the night before that tournament, the air temperature dropped cooler than it had been, and when I got to the lake that day, I was not able to catch bass on a frog. Now, I had tried several other lures and couldn't get bit. When I actually picked the frog back up, I made a cast and I backlashed. I was spending some time picking out that backlash, and as that frog was just sitting on top of this little duckweed mat, a bass came up and blew up on it, and I ended up catching that bass. And at that moment, it really clicked for me that that bass hit that frog when it was literally just sitting there. And in my mind, I thought maybe I have been fishing overfish that just wanted that frog really, really slow. So I started fishing that frog very slow, and I started getting a lot more bites. And this was like painfully slow, like casting it up on top of a mat and literally just twitching it, let it sit there for several seconds, twitching it a little bit more. It was painful, but it made the biggest difference on catching fish on a frog and not. I've also seen the exact opposite thing, where if you cast that frog out and you work it really, really quick across the water, it causes a reaction strike, and that is what makes those bass eat it. I talked about this in several other videos before, but I think that in bass fishing, if you focus on kind of the extremes, you will get a lot more bites. Everybody kind of tends to kind of hang around this middle section of the spectrum. Most of us, when we pick up a frog, we all kind of work it in a very similar way, in a very kind of similar pace. But if you go faster than the normal pace or a lot slower than that normal pace, that is where I think you start to get more bites, because you are simply doing something that is different than other anglers. And when you're doing something different, you're going to get more bites. Now, if you are fishing a lake or a pond that is completely loaded with bass and there's very little pressure, then the cadence at which you work your frog probably isn't going to make a big difference, because those bass are just really unpressured fish and they're going to hit it almost no matter how you work it. But in a lot of our lakes, rivers, and ponds, we see a lot of pressure, and that is where being different helps you to catch more bass. Now, the second big tip that I can give you when it comes to frog fishing is that you should start fishing a frog in areas where you don't typically fish a frog. I think for a lot of us, when we get to a body of water that has a lot of vegetation, kind of like what I just talked about, it's easy for us all to think, oh man, they're gonna crush a frog here. But one of my favorite places to fish a frog is underneath of a dock. My hand wasn't A lot of guys, when they think about fishing a dock, they might be thinking of throwing a jig or a Texas rig or a wacky worm, and they're not always thinking about a dock. And so doing something different, like we talked about before, can help you to get more bites when other guys are struggling. Another one of my favorite places to fish a frog is simply under overhanging trees. If you look kind of here behind me, we have shade pockets with overhanging trees. And a lot of times during the summer, you're going to have bluegill that push up really shallow to spawn. This typically happens during all the full moons and even during some new moons throughout the summer. And anytime you have those bluegill that are up shallow, you can typically find some sort of frog bite under overhanging trees. Those bass will kind of sit in those shade pockets next to those bluegill beds, and they will shoot out to grab a bluegill, and then they will come back into that shade pocket. But a lot of times, skipping your frog up underneath those overhanging trees, you will catch a lot of big bass. Tip number 3 actually comes from a question that I see a lot on the channel, and that is, when do you use a poppin style frog and when do you use the more pointed nose frog? Now, the first thing that I want to say is that sometimes it really doesn't matter which one you pick up. Now, for me, I like to fish the more pointed nose frogs anytime that I'm fishing around that thicker vegetation. If I'm dragging this across a mat, if I'm fishing it in any kind of thick lily pads or reeds, that is typically when I use the pointed nose frog. It's going to come through that cover a lot better, which means you're not going to be constantly hanging up on the cover and fouling up your lure. Now, anytime that I am fishing in open water situations, and what I mean by that is where I'm not fishing it around vegetation. If I'm skipping this bait under an overhanging tree, if I'm skipping it underneath of a dock, that is when I like to use that poppin frog. A poppin frog, with the way that they are designed, they tend to walk better back and forth. And that is the action that I like to use when I'm fishing in open water situations. Now, one exception that I do make is that if I am fishing on matted vegetation and fish are missing the pointed nose frog, I will actually step down to this Spro poppin frog right here. If you look at these two frogs, this one is a lot more slender than this one is, and I tend to have a better hookup ratio with this poppin frog, even if I'm fishing it on top of a mat. So if they're missing this frog, I will switch over to the poppin frog, and I tend to hook up with more of those bass. Now, no matter what style of frog that you use, no matter what brand of frog you use, tip number 4 is you want to set that frog up for success. And what I mean by that is, if you take a frog right out of the package, you're going to be able to catch some bass on it, but making some minor tweaks here and there to a frog is going to help you land and hook up with a lot more fish. So one thing that I typically do with most frogs is I'm going to take those 2 hooks that most frogs come with, and I'm going to bend them out just a touch. And I'm just talking just a hair. Now, although this might mean that you're going to hang up a little bit more on the cover that you are fishing, I also believe that it really can help you increase your hookup rates. And that's one of the biggest things that we want to do with frogs, is hook up with the fish that hit it. Another thing that you can do to a frog if they are missing that bait is actually add a trailer hook. There are little trailer hooks that Lake Fork Tackle makes that you can actually add to a frog that, again, really help to increase your hookup rates. For me, I actually have some frogs that are designated for very specific situations. For instance, if I am fishing very heavy matted vegetation, I have a frog that I will shove a weight into the back end and actually completely cut the legs off, and that's what I use for my mat fishing frog. That frog with that added weight will actually make a little bit of a V-wake as you're bringing it across a mat, and because it has no legs, those bass tend to get that frog a little bit better when they bust through the mat. Also, this is kind of a side note, but when it comes to setting the hook on a frog, just make sure that you feel the weight of the fish before you set the hook. Don't see an explosion and just rear back. Make sure you feel the weight of that bass. Now, tip number 5 when it comes to fishing a frog, something that I think will help you catch a lot more bass, is learning how to skip this bait. Now, I'm gonna let you know right off the bat that poppin frogs don't always tend to skip the best because of that cup. If the water hits that cup, it will actually stop it right then and there. But regardless, if you can put your frog where other guys simply cannot get their baits, you're going to get a lot more bites. And I actually made a full tutorial on how to skip lures. I'm gonna leave a link for it right here. So if you guys wanna learn how to skip a lure better, you can click on this video next. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, comment below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.